16 hours. That was all a human life was worth in 1840. 16 hours of hard labor, from the moment the first grey light cracked over the horizon until the last flame in the factory furnace flickered out. 16 hours of broken backs, bleeding hands, and hollow eyes. This is the story of the slave routine that built the Industrial Revolution and the people it destroyed along the way. His name was Samuel Burroughs, and he was 12 years old the first time he walked through the iron gates of the Whitmore Cotton Mill in Manchester, England. The year was 1840, and the city was choking on its own ambition. Smoke poured from chimneys so thick that the sun never quite reached the cobblestone streets below. The river that once ran clear was now black with dye and waste, and the smell of sulfur and damp wool clung to everything: clothes, skin, lungs. Samuel's mother, Mary, had walked him there that morning. She held his hand tight, her fingers rough as sandpaper from years of washing other people's linens. She did not look at him as they approached the mill because she could not bear to see his face. She knew what waited inside. She had heard the stories from the other women in the tenement, children who came out at the end of the day unable to straighten their spines, children who lost fingers to the spinning machines, children who simply stopped coming home one day, and nobody asked why. But there was no choice. Samuel's father, Thomas, had died 3 months earlier from a lung disease that the doctors had no name for yet, but that everyone in the factory districts recognized by its sound: a wet, rasping cough that turned to blood before it turned to silence. Without Thomas's wages, the family had nothing. Mary's washing barely covered the rent on their single room in Angel Meadow, one of the most wretched slums in all of England, where families of 8 slept on straw and rats moved through the walls like ghosts. The foreman who met them at the gate was a thick-necked man named Grindley. He looked Samuel up and down the way a butcher looks at livestock, measuring, calculating, estimating yield. He asked the boy's age, his height, whether he had all his fingers. Mary answered for him because Samuel's voice had gone somewhere deep inside his chest and would not come out. Grindley nodded and told her the terms. The boy would work from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. 16 hours. He would receive 3 shillings a week. If he was late, he would be fined. If he fell asleep at his station, he would be beaten. If he was injured, he would be replaced. There was no negotiation. There was no contract. There was only need and the ruthless machinery of progress. Mary kissed Samuel on the forehead. She whispered something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said, "You are not what they make you do. Remember that." And then she turned and walked away, and Samuel watched her disappear into the grey morning fog, and he understood in that moment, with a clarity far beyond his years, that childhood was something that happened to other people. Inside the mill, the noise was the first thing that attacked him. The thundering of the power looms was so loud it felt like standing inside a drum being beaten by a giant. The air was thick with cotton dust that floated like snow and settled in the lungs like cement. Hundreds of workers moved between the machines, women, men, and mostly children. Some were younger than Samuel. He saw a girl who could not have been more than 7, crawling beneath a loom to gather loose threads, her tiny body fitting into spaces designed for no human being. Her face was blank, not sad, not scared, blank, as if whatever had once lived behind her eyes had already packed up and left. Samuel was assigned to the spinning room under the supervision of a man called Mr. Tate, who carried a leather strap and used it freely. His job was simple enough to describe and brutal enough to endure. He was a piecer, which meant he had to lean over the spinning machine, find broken threads, and tie them back together over and over and over for 16 hours straight. The machine never stopped, the threads never stopped breaking, and Samuel's small fingers, quick as they were, could never move fast enough. By the end of that first day, his back ached so badly he could not stand straight. His fingers were raw and bleeding from the thread. His ears rang from the noise. His lungs burned from the dust. He was given 20 minutes for a meal, a piece of bread and a cup of water, eaten standing beside his machine because sitting down was not permitted. When the bell finally rang at 9 o'clock, he stumbled out into the darkness of Manchester and walked the mile back to Angel Meadow on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Mary was waiting for him. She did not ask how it was. She could see. She fed him what she had, cold porridge and a bit of cheese, and she held him while he slept on the straw mattress they shared with his two younger siblings. And before dawn, the cycle began again. 5 o'clock, the bell, the gates, the noise, the dust, the strap, the thread. 16 hours. This was not the exception. This was the system. In 1840, the British Empire was building its wealth on the backs of millions of workers, just like Samuel, men, women and children who were technically free, but lived in conditions that mirrored slavery in everything but name. The factories needed small hands and obedient bodies, and poverty provided them in endless supply. The mill owners lived in mansions on the hills above Manchester, where the air was clean and the gardens were green. And they spoke of progress and prosperity, while the people who created that prosperity died in the streets below. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because here we tell the stories that history tried to bury, and if you do not hear them from us, you may never hear them at all. Hit subscribe now and stay for what comes next, because Samuel's story is only beginning. Months passed and Samuel Burrows learned the rhythm of survival the way an animal learns the boundaries of a cage. Wake before dawn. Walk through streets still wet with the night's rain and the waste thrown from windows above. Enter the mill, work. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not slow down. Do not cry. Do not think about anything except the next thread, the next knot, the next hour. And when the body screams, ignore it, because the body is a tool and tools do not have feelings. By the time Samuel turned 13, he had grown taller, but thinner. His ribs showed through his shirt. His hands, once the soft hands of a boy, were now the calloused, scarred hands of something older. He had lost the tip of his left ring finger 3 months into his employment when it caught in the spindle. Mr. Tate had wrapped it in a dirty rag and told him to get back to work. There was no doctor. There was no day of rest. The machine did not care about fingers, and neither did the men who owned it. But something else had also grown inside Samuel during those months. An awareness. He began to notice things that the exhaustion had previously hidden from him. He noticed that the older workers coughed the same way his father had coughed. He noticed that children disappeared from the factory floor and were never mentioned again. He noticed that the food they were given, when they were given food at all, was often spoiled, and that the water they drank came from the same river that carried the factory's waste. And he noticed Eleanor. Eleanor Price was 14, tall for her age, with dark hair she kept tied back with a piece of string, and eyes that burned with something Samuel could not name at first, but would later come to recognize as defiance. She worked in the weaving room on the floor above Samuel's station, and she had been at the Whitmore Mill since she was 9. She was one of the fastest weavers in the factory, which meant she was valuable, which meant the foreman was slightly less brutal with her. Slightly. They first spoke during one of the rare moments when the machines were stopped for maintenance. Samuel had gone to the water pump in the yard, and Eleanor was there, wringing out a cloth she had soaked to cool her neck. She looked at him directly, which was unusual. Most of the workers had learned to keep their eyes down, as if visibility itself was dangerous. "You are the one who lost his finger," she said. It was not a question. Samuel nodded, instinctively hiding his left hand behind his back. "Do not hide it," Eleanor said. "It is proof." "Proof of what?" Samuel asked. "Proof of what they are doing to us." That conversation changed everything. Eleanor, it turned out, could read. Her mother had been a governess before falling into poverty after her husband's death, and she had taught Eleanor letters and numbers in the evenings by candlelight. This made Eleanor extraordinary in Angel Meadow, where most people could not sign their own names. And Eleanor had used this skill to do something dangerous. She had been reading pamphlets. The pamphlets came from the Chartist movement and from factory reform activists who were fighting to change the laws that allowed children to be worked to death in British mills. Men like Lord Ashley were speaking in Parliament about the horrors of child labour, and newspapers were beginning to publish accounts from factory workers that shocked the comfortable classes. Eleanor had gotten her hands on some of these pamphlets through a bookshop owner in Deansgate who sympathised with the workers' cause, and she had been quietly sharing them with a small group of trusted workers inside the mill. "They want to pass a law," Eleanor told Samuel one evening as they walked back toward Angel Meadow together. "A law that says no child under 13 can work more than 6 hours, and no one under 18 can work more than 12. Samuel stared at her. The idea of working only 12 hours felt like being told he could fly. "They will never allow it," he said. "The owners will never allow it." "The owners do not get to decide everything," Eleanor replied. "Not if enough people speak." It was Eleanor who convinced Samuel to attend a secret meeting held in the back room of a pub called the Crooked Dog on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. A dozen workers crowded into a space meant for half that number, their faces lit by a single oil lamp. A man named Henry Fielding, a former mill worker who had lost his arm to a machine at the age of 16, stood before them and spoke in a low, steady voice about dignity, about rights, about the simple idea that a human being was worth more than the cloth they produced. Samuel listened and felt something stir inside his chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. Something that made the 16 hours feel less like a death sentence and more like a fight. But the mills had eyes everywhere. Informants were common, because desperate people will do desperate things for an extra shilling, and within a week, word of the meetings reached the ears of Mr. Whitmore himself. The mill owner, a man Samuel had never seen in person, but whose name hung over the factory like a curse. The retaliation was swift. 3 workers who had attended the meeting were dismissed without pay. Eleanor was moved to the worst station in the weaving room, directly beneath a leaking roof where the damp made the threads snap constantly, guaranteeing she would fall behind on her quota and face punishment. And Samuel was given a new assignment, cleaning beneath the machines while they were still running, the single most dangerous job in the mill, the job that had killed 2 boys the previous year. The message was clear. Silence was the price of survival, and anyone who refused to pay that price would be crushed, not by the machines but by the men who owned them. If this story is making you feel something, drop a comment right now and tell us. What would you have done in Samuel's place? Would you have stayed silent or would you have risked everything? Samuel stood at the edge of a choice that no 13-year-old should ever have to make. Submit and live another day in chains. Speak and risk losing everything, including his life. He looked at his left hand at the missing fingertip, at what Eleanor had called proof, and he made his decision. The winter of 1841 came to Manchester like a punishment. Frost clung to the inside of the tenement windows, and the streets of Angel Meadow turned to rivers of frozen mud and filth. Inside the Whitmore mill, the cold made everything worse. The metal machines were like ice to the touch, and the cotton dust mixed with the freezing air to create a cough that swept through the workers like wildfire. 3 children died that January, not from accidents, but from fever and malnutrition, and the slow, grinding collapse of bodies pushed far beyond their limits. Samuel worked his new position beneath the running machines with a focus that bordered on madness. Every day he crawled into the narrow spaces between the iron frames, while the belts and gears churned above him, inches from his head. One wrong movement, one moment of lost concentration, and he would be pulled into the mechanism and torn apart. He had seen it happen. He had heard the sound and a short, sharp scream followed by the wet crunch of bone, and the machines continued indifferent rhythm. The machines never stopped, not for injury, not for death, not for anything. But Samuel did not stop either. He continued meeting with Eleanor and the small group of workers who had not been frightened into silence. The meetings moved to different locations each week, a cellar here, an alley there, once in the crypt of a church, whose minister turned a blind eye because his own conscience would not let him do otherwise. Henry Fielding continued to speak and to organize, and slowly, carefully, their numbers grew. Eleanor had made contact with a journalist named William Dodd, a man who had himself worked in the mills as a child and now dedicated his life to exposing the conditions inside them. Dodd was working on a book, and he needed testimony, real specific name testimony from workers willing to tell their stories publicly. This was the most dangerous request imaginable. To speak publicly was to guarantee dismissal, blacklisting, and possibly worse. The mill owners had connections to the local magistrates, and workers who caused trouble had a way of ending up in prison on manufactured charges. But Eleanor did not hesitate. She told Dodd everything: the hours, the beatings, the children who disappeared, the food that was not fit for animals, the water that carried disease, the air that filled lungs with fiber until they hardened like stone. She named names. She gave dates, and she convinced Samuel to do the same. When Dodd published his account, it caused a sensation. The comfortable classes of England, who had been happy to buy cheap cotton and cheap cloth without asking where it came from, were suddenly confronted with the truth. Members of Parliament read Dodd's accounts aloud in the House of Commons, and the public response was one of outrage. Petitions were signed. Demonstrations were held. The pressure for reform, which had been building for years, reached a critical point. Mr. Whitmore predictably was furious. He called Eleanor and Samuel into his office, a room neither of them had ever entered, a room with carpet on the floor and paintings on the walls and a fire burning in a marble fireplace. Whitmore was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold eyes, and he spoke to them with the calm, measured voice of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. He told them they were dismissed. He told them they would never work in any mill in Manchester again. He told Eleanor that she was a foolish girl who would end up in the workhouse, and he told Samuel that his mother would suffer for his choices. And then he looked at them both and said something that Samuel would never forget. He said, "You think you matter. You do not. You are thread. When you break, I replace you." Eleanor met his eyes and said, "Thread, sir, is what holds everything together. Cut enough of it, and the whole cloth falls apart." They were escorted from the building by 2 foremen and left standing in the street in the middle of a January afternoon, with no wages, no references, and no prospects. Mary, when she heard the news, sat down on the straw mattress and put her face in her hands and did not move for a long time. The younger children watched with wide, frightened eyes. There was no anger in Mary. She was too exhausted for anger. There was only the quiet, crushing weight of a life that refused to offer mercy. But the story did not end there. It never does, when ordinary people decide that they would rather break than bend. The testimony that Eleanor and Samuel had given became part of a larger wave of evidence that swept through Parliament. Lord Ashley, who had been fighting for factory reform for over a decade, used their accounts and hundreds of others to push for stronger legislation. The resistance from the mill owners was fierce. They argued that regulation would destroy the economy, that workers were free to leave if they were unhappy, that the market should decide the conditions of labor. They paid journalists to write in their defense. They pressured politicians to vote against reform. They reminded everyone that the British Empire's wealth depended on the factories, and the factories depended on cheap labor. And cheap labor meant long hours and low wages, and any attempt to change this was an attack on progress itself. Stop for a moment. If this story is hitting you deep, comment the phrase, "Their pain was not in vain." Let us fill the comment section with this message so that every person who watches this video feels the weight of what these people endured. Comment it now. But the tide had turned. The evidence was too overwhelming. The stories were too brutal. The public conscience, slow as it was to wake, had finally opened its eyes. In 1844, Parliament passed a new Factory Act that limited working hours for women and children, required safety guards on machinery, and mandated basic standards for ventilation and cleanliness. It was not enough. It was never enough. But it was a beginning. A crack in the wall. Samuel Burrows did not return to the mills. He found work as a laborer on the railway, grueling work, but work with limits, work in the open air, work that did not require him to crawl beneath machines that could kill him. Eleanor became involved with the growing cooperative movement, using her literacy to help workers organize their own shops and mutual aid societies. They remained friends for the rest of their lives. Years later, in the spring of 1860, Samuel Burrows stood on a hill overlooking Manchester and barely recognized the city that had nearly killed him. The skyline was still thick with chimneys, the air still heavy with industry. But something had changed. Not everything, not enough, but something. The Factory Acts had been strengthened repeatedly. Children under 10 could no longer be employed in textile mills. Working hours had been reduced. Inspectors, imperfect as they were, now walked the factory floors. The movement that Samuel and Eleanor and Henry and thousands of others had been part of The movement born in back rooms and cellars and the pages of pamphlets had reshaped the laws of the most powerful nation on earth. Samuel was 32 years old, but he looked older. His back had never fully straightened from those years hunched over the spinning machine. His left hand, with its missing fingertip, ached in the cold. His lungs carried the cotton dust like a permanent resident, a quiet reminder that the body keeps the score long after the mind has moved on. But he was alive, and he was free, not in the way that the mill owners understood freedom, not the freedom to starve quietly and call it liberty, but a deeper freedom, the freedom that comes from having refused to be silent when silence was the easier path. He had married a woman named Catherine, a teacher who ran a small school for working-class children in Salford. Together, they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The oldest boy was named Thomas, after Samuel's father, and when Samuel looked at him, he saw echoes of the man who had coughed himself to death in a tenement room so that the mills could keep spinning. The girl was named Eleanor, and if anyone asked why, Samuel would smile and say it was after a friend who had taught him that proof was not something to hide. Eleanor Price herself had never married. She had devoted her life to the cooperative movement and to education, traveling across the north of England to help establish reading rooms and lending libraries in factory towns. She believed with a conviction that never wavered. That literacy was the most dangerous weapon the working class possessed. More dangerous than any strike or riot, because it could not be taken away. When she and Samuel met, which they did regularly, they would sit together and drink tea and talk about the old days with a strange mixture of horror and gratitude. Horror at what they had survived, gratitude that they had survived it at all. Henry Fielding, the one-armed organizer who had spoken so powerfully in that back room of the Crooked Dog, did not live to see the full fruits of his labor. He died in 1852 at the age of 45 from the same lung disease that had killed Samuel's father, and that would eventually be given a name: byssinosis, brown lung disease, the textile workers' curse. At his funeral, over 200 workers gathered in the rain, and a man who had known him said simply, "He gave his arm to the machine and his life to the rest of us." Mr. Whitmore, the mill owner who had dismissed Samuel and Eleanor with such cold contempt, continued to operate the Whitmore cotton mill for another 15 years. He adapted to the new regulations reluctantly, complaining constantly about the cost of compliance and the erosion of his profits. He died wealthy, in a large house, surrounded by comfort, and was eulogized in the local press as a captain of industry and a pillar of the community. The obituary did not mention the children who had died in his factory. It did not mention the fingers and arms and lungs that had been consumed by his machines. History, it seemed, had a selective memory. But history also has a way of correcting itself, slowly, unevenly, like a river finding its true course through stone. The system that Samuel Burroughs was born into, the system that treated human beings as disposable fuel for the engine of progress, did not end cleanly or completely. It evolved. It changed its face and its language and its geography. The factories moved to other countries, other continents, other children with other names and other languages, and the same logic applied, that progress required sacrifice, and sacrifice meant someone else's body and someone else's time and someone else's life. And that is the truth that this story forces us to confront. The Industrial Revolution was not built by machines. It was built by people, by 12-year-old boys with bleeding fingers, and 14-year-old girls who could read pamphlets by candlelight, and one-armed men who spoke of dignity in dark rooms. It was built by 16-hour days and 3-shilling weeks, and lungs full of cotton dust. It was built by a system that called itself freedom while it operated like slavery, and it was challenged by ordinary people who decided, at great personal cost, that they were worth more than the cloth they produced. Samuel Burroughs never became famous. His name does not appear in the history books that celebrate the great inventors and industrialists of the 19th century. Neither does Eleanor's, neither does Henry's. But the world they fought for, a world with labor laws and safety standards, and the radical idea that a child should not be worked to death for profit, exists because of them, because of their pain, because of their courage, because of the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that this was all a human life could be. 16 hours. That was the routine, that was the system, that was the price of progress. And the people who paid that price deserve to be remembered, not with statues or monuments, but with the truth, the whole unvarnished, uncomfortable truth. And that truth is this: every comfort we enjoy today was purchased by someone else's suffering. The question is not whether we can change the past. We cannot. The question is whether we will allow the same story to be written again, with different names, in different factories, in different parts of the world. Because right now, at this very moment, somewhere on this planet there is a child standing at the gates of a mill, and the foreman is measuring them with his eyes, and the machine is already running. If you watch this far, it is because this story moved something inside you, and that matters. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like. It costs you nothing, but it helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. Share it with someone who cares about history, about justice, about the invisible people who built the world we live in. If you are not yet subscribed, subscribe now, because we tell the stories that the textbooks left out, the stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And if you made it to the very end, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and know who truly values the stories on this channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring, and thank you for remembering.